My dad raised his glass, smiled at a room full of people, and said, "This is my daughter, no degree, no future, just living off the family." And the laughter that followed felt louder than the music, sharper than anything he had ever said to me before. Like every single person in that room suddenly agreed I was nothing, like I had always been nothing, and the worst part was, my husband laughed too, just a quiet chuckle under his breath, like he didn't even realize what that moment would cost him. I didn't flinch, I didn't argue, I didn't even blink. I just stood there holding my glass, feeling 200 eyes on me, waiting for me to shrink, to apologize, to prove them right. And instead I smiled, raised my glass slightly higher, and said, "Cheers, this is the last time any of you will ever see me." And then I walked out, heels echoing across marble, the laughter dying behind me, until the entire room fell into a silence so heavy it almost followed me out the door. If you're listening right now and something about this moment hits a little too close to home, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel invisible by the people who are supposed to stand by you, then go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, along with your local time, but only if this story truly resonates with you, because stories like this aren't just stories, they're reminders of who we become when everything is taken from us. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and that night, my father's retirement party was the night everything in my family broke apart for good. Even though no one in that room realized it yet, 3 hours earlier, I had parked my car outside the country club, sitting behind the wheel for a full minute with the engine off, staring at the building like it belonged to another life, one I had already left behind, the lights inside warm and golden. Silhouettes moving past tall windows, laughter already spilling out onto the driveway, and I remember thinking I didn't belong there anymore. Not really, not after everything that had happened, but I went in anyway, because some part of me still believed stupidly that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they would see me differently. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. Conversations dipped just slightly, heads turned, not in surprise, but in recognition, like I was exactly who they expected me to be. Nothing more, nothing less. My stepmother Linda standing near the bar in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my first car, smiling at me in that polite, distant way that never quite reached her eyes. "Emily," she said, like she was greeting a guest, not family. "You made it." And before I could even respond, my younger sister Ashley leaned over and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "I didn't think you'd show up," followed by a soft laugh like it was a joke. Like everything about me had always been a joke. My older brother Ryan gave me a quick nod from across the room, already in the middle of a conversation about investments and promotions. Things I was never included in. Things I was never expected to understand. And my husband Mark, standing right next to him, barely looked at me, just lifted his glass slightly before turning back to Ryan, like I was an afterthought, like I always had been. I moved through the room slowly, past people who had watched me grow up. People who used to ask me what I wanted to be when I was older and now didn't ask anything at all, because somewhere along the way, my answer had stopped mattering, replaced by assumptions, by quiet judgments, by the version of me my family had decided was easier to accept. "So what are you doing these days?" One of my dad's colleagues asked casually, not even looking directly at me, and before I could answer, Linda stepped in smoothly, her voice light, almost amused. "Oh, Emily's still figuring things out," she said. And the way she said it, still like I had been stuck in the same place for years, like I had never moved forward, never grown, never changed, made a few people smile politely, made someone else nod, like it made perfect sense, and I just stood there, letting it happen, letting them fill in the blanks of a life they knew nothing about. I could have corrected them. I could have said something, anything, but I didn't. Because by then I had already learned something important: explaining yourself to people who have already decided who you are is a losing game. The music got louder as the night went on, glasses clinking, voices rising, the room filling with that comfortable kind of noise that comes from people who feel completely at ease, completely certain of their place in the world. And somewhere in the middle of it all, my dad took the stage, straightening his tie, tapping the microphone twice as the room gradually quieted down, the kind of quiet that carries respect, admiration, attention, the kind I had never once felt directed at me in that room. He started with stories about his career, about sacrifices, about success, about how proud he was of everything he had built, and people laughed in all the right places, nodded at all the right moments, completely in sync with him, and then, halfway through, he shifted. His tone lighter, almost playful, like he was about to share something amusing, something harmless. And, of course, he said, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me, I couldn't have done it without my family. And for a second, just a second, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment he would acknowledge me, see me, include me, but then he smiled, that familiar smile I had learned to read years ago, and said the words that would split everything in two, and I felt it before I even fully processed it. The shift in the room, the laughter rising, the weight of it pressing down on me, and that's where everything really began, even though no one else knew it yet, not even me. The laughter did not stop right away. It rolled through the room in waves, soft at first and then louder, as people repeated the line to each other like it was clever, like it was harmless, and I stood there with my glass still in my hand, feeling the condensation slide slowly down onto my fingers, while my father continued smiling like he had just delivered the perfect joke, like humiliating me was part of his legacy, part of the story he wanted people to remember about his life. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, some curious, some amused, a few uncomfortable, but not enough to say anything, never enough to interrupt. And I caught a glimpse of Ashley covering her mouth as she laughed, leaning into one of her friends as if this was the most predictable thing in the world, as if I had always been the punchline. Ryan did not laugh out loud, but he did not stop it either. He just shook his head slightly with that quiet smirk he always had when something confirmed what he already believed, that I had never lived up to anything, that I had wasted every opportunity, and Mark, standing right there in his navy suit, adjusted his watch and let out that small breath of amusement again, not loud enough to be noticed by anyone else, but loud enough for me to hear. Loud enough for me to understand exactly where I stood. My father kept talking, adding little comments like he was building on the joke, saying how I had always taken my time finding direction, and how some kids just need a little more support than others. And each word landed heavier than the last, because it was not just what he was saying. It was how easily everyone accepted it, how naturally it fit into the version of me they had already created in their minds. I remember thinking how strange it was that none of them knew anything about my life. Not really. Not the early mornings, or the long nights, or the decisions I had made that no one had ever seen, and yet somehow they all felt completely confident judging it, defining it, reducing it to something small enough to laugh at. Someone near the back raised their glass and said, "At least she has family to rely on." And that drew another round of laughter. Softer this time, but still sharp enough to cut through whatever part of me had hoped, even for a second, that this night might go differently. My father finally lowered the microphone, satisfied, stepping back as applause filled the room. Applause for his career, for his stories, for everything he had built, and I realized in that moment that I had never really been part of that picture. Not in the way that mattered, not in the way that earned respect. I had only ever been an afterthought, a footnote, something he could use when it was convenient and dismiss when it was not. I took a slow breath, steady and controlled, the way I had trained myself to do in situations where reacting too quickly could cost you more than silence ever would, and I let the noise settle around me, let the moment stretch just long enough for people to start wondering what I would do. Because they were watching. Even the ones who pretended not to be, they were waiting for something, maybe a reaction, maybe an apology, maybe proof that everything my father had said was true. I set my shoulders back slightly. Not enough for anyone to notice consciously, but enough for me to feel the difference. And I looked around the room one more time, really looked this time, at the people who had known me for years and still chose not to see me, at the family who had decided who I was long before I ever had the chance to become anything else, and something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, Final understanding that there was nothing left here for me to fix, nothing left here to prove. When I raised my glass and spoke, my voice was calm, steady, almost light, like I was simply joining in on the tone of the evening, and for a split second, some of them smiled again, expecting another joke, another moment they could laugh at. But what I said did not land the way they expected. It hung in the air instead, heavy and unfamiliar. And I saw it happen in real time, the confusion first, then the hesitation. Then the silence beginning to spread from one corner of the room to the other. I did not wait for it to settle completely. I did not wait for questions or reactions or anything at all. I just lowered my glass, turned, and walked toward the exit. Each step measured, unhurried, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that felt almost too loud now that the laughter had stopped. And I could feel it behind me, that shift in energy, the way conversations stalled. The way people watched me leave without quite understanding why it suddenly felt like something important had just happened. I passed the bar where Linda stood frozen for a second longer than usual, her expression caught somewhere between irritation and disbelief. Like she was trying to decide whether to follow me or let me go, and I kept walking. Past the doors, out into the cool night air where the noise from inside faded into something distant and irrelevant, and for the first time that evening, I let myself exhale fully, the kind of breath you do not realize you have been holding until you finally release it. I reached my car and paused with my hand on the door, looking back at the building one last time. The lights still glowing, the silhouettes still moving behind the windows, everything continuing as if nothing had changed, and maybe for them. Nothing had. Not yet, but for me, something had closed completely. Something that would not reopen no matter what happened next. And as I got into the driver's seat and started the engine, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They thought I had just walked away in defeat. They thought they had seen the end of the story. But they had no idea that they had just witnessed the beginning of something they were not prepared for. The drive home was quiet in a way that did not feel peaceful, just empty, like the kind of silence that follows something you cannot undo. And I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel as the headlights cut through the dark road, mile after mile. The country club disappearing behind me like it had never really been part of my life to begin with. And for a while I did not think about anything at all. I just focused on the road, on the rhythm of the tires against the pavement, on the steady breathing I had trained myself to maintain even when everything inside me was shifting. It was not until I stopped at a red light about 10 minutes from my apartment that the night started catching up to me, not in a wave of emotion, not in anything dramatic, but in small details, the way my father's voice had sounded through the microphone, the exact timing of the laughter, the way Mark had not looked at me after, not even once, like acknowledging me would have made it more real. And I realized something then that should have been obvious much earlier, that none of what happened tonight was new. It was just the first time it had been said out loud in front of people who mattered to them. I pulled into my building's parking garage, the concrete walls echoing faintly as I parked in my usual spot, the one no one else ever used because most people in the building assumed I worked odd hours or traveled too much to be consistent. And in a way they were right, just not in the way anyone would guess. And as I sat there with the engine off, I let the quiet settle again. Different this time, heavier but clearer, like everything was finally lining up into something I could understand. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with Mark's name, and I watched it ring without moving, without reaching for it, just letting it vibrate until it stopped. And then a second later, a message came through, short and simple. You did not have to make a scene. And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed exactly what I already knew, that even now, even after everything, he still saw it that way. Like I was the one who had crossed a line. Like leaving quietly was somehow worse than what had been said about me in a room full of people. I picked up the phone, read the message again, and then set it back down without replying, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to fix. And more importantly, nothing left that I wanted to carry with me into what came next. When I finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the elevator, the cool air in the garage felt sharper against my skin, grounding me, reminding me where I was, reminding me that this part of my life, the part no one had bothered to ask about, was real whether they believed it or not. And as the elevator doors closed and began to rise, I caught my reflection in the metal panel. The same dress I had worn to the party, the same composed expression, but something behind it had shifted, something quieter and more certain. Like a decision had already been made long before tonight, and this was just the moment it became visible. Inside my apartment, everything was exactly where I had left it. Clean, minimal, intentional, no unnecessary decorations, no reminders of the life my family thought I was living. Just the essentials, the things that mattered. And I moved through the space with practiced ease, setting my keys down, placing my glass from earlier in the sink, slipping off my heels and setting them neatly by the door. Each action deliberate, controlled, like resetting after a long day. My phone buzzed again, this time with multiple notifications. Missed calls from Linda, a message from Ashley asking if I was overreacting on purpose. Another from Ryan that simply said, "You embarrassed Dad." And I scrolled through them without stopping, without responding, because the pattern was the same, the blame was already assigned, the narrative already decided, and there was no version of this where they would suddenly see it differently tonight. I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet, reaching past the dresses and casual clothes to the back where a garment bag hung untouched, at least from their perspective, but not from mine, and I paused for a second before unzipping it, revealing the uniform inside, pressed, precise, every line exactly where it should be. The kind of detail that does not happen by accident. The kind of detail that represents years of discipline, years of choices no one in that room had ever witnessed. And I ran my hand lightly over the fabric, not out of sentiment, but out of recognition, like acknowledging a part of myself that had never needed their approval to exist. On the dresser, my watch sat next to a small, secured case, and I opened it carefully, revealing the insignia that most people would not recognize unless they understood what it meant, unless they understood what it took to earn it. And I thought about how many times I had almost told them, how many times I had considered explaining, proving, correcting the story they had built about me, and every time I had chosen not to, not because I was hiding, but because I did not need them to understand in order for it to be true. My phone buzzed again, this time a different tone, one I did not ignore. And I picked it up, reading the message quickly. The kind of message that does not waste words, that does not leave room for interpretation, confirming what I already knew was coming. And I typed a short response, just one line, clear and direct, before setting the phone down again. I stepped back from the dresser, looking at the uniform, the insignia, the life that existed completely outside of everything that had happened tonight. And for the first time since I left the party, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not because anything had been resolved yet, not because anything had been revealed, but because I knew something they did not, something that would not stay hidden much longer. And as I turned off the lights and let the room fall into darkness, I realized that tonight had not taken anything from me. It had only confirmed what I was already ready to leave behind. And what was coming next would not be a reaction, it would be a choice. The next morning did not come with clarity or relief. It came with structure, with routine, with the kind of discipline that does not ask how you feel before it tells you what needs to be done. And I woke up before the sun, the room still dark, the city outside quiet, the air cool against my skin as I sat up and let the silence settle for a moment before my feet touched the floor, because this was the part of my life no one had ever seen. The part that existed long before last night and would continue long after it. The part that did not depend on anyone's approval or understanding. I moved through my apartment with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, just following the rhythm that had been built over years, making coffee, checking the time, reviewing the message that had come through the night before, the one that mattered, the one that confirmed what the next 72 hours would look like. And there was no emotion attached to it, just focus, just clarity, the kind that comes when you know exactly where you are supposed to be and why. My phone lit up again on the counter, more messages, more missed calls, the names the same as before. Mark, Linda, Ashley, even my father now, and I let them sit there unanswered, not out of anger, not out of spite, but because none of those conversations belonged in this space. None of them had anything to do with what I was about to step into. And I had learned a long time ago that you do not carry unnecessary weight into situations that require precision. By the time the first light started to break through the windows, I was already dressed. Not in the clothes they expected, not in anything they had ever seen me wear, but in something that fit differently. Something that carried its own presence without needing explanation. And when I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the final detail, I did not see the version of myself they had laughed at. I saw the version they had never been invited to understand, the one built quietly, consistently, without their input. The drive that morning was different from the night before, the same roads, the same turns, but everything felt sharper, more defined, like the world had shifted slightly into focus. And as I passed familiar places, the grocery store on the corner, the gas station, 2 blocks down, the park where families walk their dogs in the early hours, I realized how separate my life had become from theirs, how little overlap there actually was between what they believed and what was real. When I reached the gate, the guard barely needed to check my identification before nodding, the recognition immediate, professional, and I drove through without slowing, the environment around me changing in an instant, structured, controlled, every movement intentional, every detail accounted for, and it grounded me in a way nothing else could, because here, there were no assumptions, no whispered judgments, no roles assigned based on old narratives, only performance, only responsibility. Only what you had proven you could carry. I parked in my designated spot and stepped out, the air cooler here, carrying a different kind of weight. And as I walked across the lot, I could feel the shift in posture, in awareness, the subtle acknowledgments from others who passed by, not exaggerated, not performative, just precise, the kind that comes from understanding exactly who someone is without needing to say it out loud. And I returned each one the same way, measured, consistent. Because respect here was not given casually, it was earned and maintained. Inside, the day moved quickly. Briefings, updates, confirmations, each piece of information fitting into a larger picture that had been building long before last night. And I stayed focused, present, not allowing anything from outside to interrupt the flow, because this was not the place for distraction, not the place for emotion. And there was something almost grounding in that, something steady in knowing exactly what was expected and delivering it without question. At one point, as I reviewed a set of documents, my phone buzzed again in my pocket, persistent, insistent, and I knew without checking who it was, what it would say, the same questions, the same accusations, the same attempt to pull me back into a version of myself I had already outgrown, and I let it buzz, let it stop. Let it fade into the background where it belonged, because nothing about last night had changed what mattered here. Nothing about their perception had any impact on the reality I was standing in. Later, in a quieter moment, I stepped outside for a few seconds, just long enough to take in the air, the open space, the controlled movement around me, and I thought about the room from the night before, the laughter, the assumptions, the certainty they had all shared about who I was. And I realized how small it all felt now, how limited, how disconnected from the truth, and not in a way that made me angry, but in a way that made everything clearer, simpler, easier to let go of. When I checked my phone again, hours later, there were more messages. Longer now, more urgent. My father asking where I had gone, Mark asking why I was not answering, Linda suggesting that I needed to fix what I had done, and I read them all without reacting. Without responding, because there was nothing to fix, nothing to explain, only a distance that had already been created and would only grow from here. As the day moved forward, the timeline in my mind became more defined, 72 hours, a sequence already in motion, pieces already aligned, and I knew that when the moment came, it would not be chaotic. It would not be emotional. It would be precise, controlled, undeniable, and for the first time, I understood that what happened last night was not the worst part of the story. It was simply the last time they would ever have the chance to see me without knowing exactly who I was. By the time the second day began, the noise from my phone had turned into something distant, almost irrelevant, like a conversation happening in another room that I had already decided not to enter, and I moved through the morning the same way I had the day before. Structured, deliberate. Each step aligned with a schedule that did not leave space for distraction, because what was coming required clarity, not reaction. The messages had shifted overnight, less casual now, more urgent. My father asking why I had not returned his calls, Linda framing it as concern but layered with control, Ashley accusing me of being dramatic, and Mark's messages longer this time, trying to explain, trying to soften what had happened as if it could be rewritten after the fact, as if intent mattered more than impact, and I read them all without replying, not because I did not have answers, but because they were asking the wrong questions. When I stepped outside, the air felt colder than the day before, a sharp breeze cutting across the open space as I walked toward the building, and everything around me moved with the same precision. The same quiet understanding of roles and responsibility, and it grounded me again, reminding me that there was a version of the world where people did not need to explain who they were because their actions had already made it clear. Inside, the day unfolded with a kind of intensity that required full attention. Briefings layered over briefings, timelines narrowing, details becoming sharper, and I stayed focused, not allowing my thoughts to drift back to the night that had already passed, because in this environment, hesitation was not just a weakness, it was a liability. At one point, as I reviewed a set of updates, a colleague paused beside me, not saying much, just a short acknowledgement, the kind that carried weight without needing explanation, and I returned it the same way, because here, respect was measured in consistency, not words. Around midday, I finally stepped aside for a moment, just long enough to check my phone again, and this time there was a voicemail from my father, his voice different from what I had heard on stage, less confident, less certain, asking where I had gone, asking why I had left like that, and for a second, I listened to the tone more than the words, the shift in it, the absence of the audience that had made everything sound so easy the night before, and I realized something simple, but important. He did not understand what had happened, not really, because for him, it had been a moment, a joke, something that passed as quickly as it was spoken, but for me, it had been the final confirmation of something that had been building for years. I did not call him back. I did not respond. I just saved the message and put the phone away because there was nothing in that conversation that needed to happen before what was already in motion. The afternoon moved faster, the timeline tightening, each step bringing everything closer to the moment that had been set long before any of them had decided who I was. And I could feel it in the way people moved, in the way instructions were given and followed without hesitation, in the way everything aligned toward a single outcome that did not depend on opinions or assumptions, only execution. Later, as I walked through a quieter corridor, I passed a reflective surface and caught a glimpse of myself again, not stopping, just noticing the posture, the focus, the absence of doubt. And I thought about the version of me they had laughed at, the one defined by what they did not see, and how completely separate she was from the person walking here now, not because I had changed overnight, but because they had never taken the time to look closely enough to understand. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, persistent, insistent, and this time when I checked it, there was a message from Mark that stood out from the rest, longer, more direct, asking where I really was, saying that none of this made sense, that I was not telling him something, and I read it carefully, taking in the shift from dismissal to suspicion, from certainty to doubt. And I realized that the cracks had already started to form, small at first, barely noticeable, but enough to change the way he was looking at everything, enough to make him question the version of me he had accepted so easily before. I did not answer him either. Not yet, because answers given too early lose their impact, and what was coming was not something that could be explained in a message or a call. It had to be seen, understood in a way that left no room for interpretation. As the day came to a close, the final confirmations came through, short, precise, everything aligned exactly as expected, and I felt that quiet certainty settle in again. The same one I had felt the night before when I stood in that room and chose not to react. The same one that had guided every decision since. And I knew now that the next step would not just change how they saw me, it would change how they saw themselves in relation to me. When I returned to my apartment that evening, the space felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the timeline had moved forward, because the moment that had once been distant was now close enough to touch, and I moved through the same routine, setting things in place, preparing without rush, without hesitation, because everything that needed to be done was already clear. My phone lit up one more time as I set it down on the counter, my father's name appearing again, and this time I let it ring longer than before, just watching it, considering it for a moment, before it finally stopped, and I understood that by the time he heard from me again, it would not be a conversation, it would be a realization, one that he would not be able to laugh off, not this time. And as I turned away from the counter and looked toward the uniform waiting in the other room, I knew that the version of me they thought they understood was about to disappear completely, replaced by something they would not be able to ignore. The third morning arrived without hesitation, like everything else in my life now, precise, expected, already accounted for long before it began, and I woke up before the alarm again. Not because I needed to, but because my body had already adjusted to the rhythm of what was coming, the final day in a sequence that had been set in motion quietly, deliberately, without anyone in my family realizing that every hour since that night had been leading here. I sat at the edge of my bed for a moment, not thinking about them, not replaying anything, just focusing on the stillness, on the control I had over this moment, because that was something they had never understood. They thought control came from money or status, or being the loudest voice in the room, but they were wrong. Control came from knowing exactly who you were and not needing anyone else to confirm it. I stood, moved through the apartment one last time with the same calm routine, everything already prepared, everything exactly where it needed to be. And when I stepped into the bedroom and unzipped the garment bag again, there was no pause this time, no hesitation, just action. Each movement practiced, intentional, the uniform fitting the way it always had. Precise, structured, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with fabric and everything to do with what it represented. As I adjusted the final detail in the mirror, I met my own reflection, not searching for reassurance, not questioning anything, just acknowledging it, the reality of who I had become, the version of myself that existed completely outside the narrow definition my family had placed on me, and for a brief second, I thought about how differently that room would have looked if they had known, if they had understood even a fraction of this. But then I let the thought go, because it did not matter, not anymore. My phone buzzed again on the dresser, and when I picked it up, there was a message from Mark that was different from the others, shorter this time, more direct. "Where are you really?" And I read it once, then set the phone back down without answering, because the answer was not something he was ready to hear in a message, and thanks for and thanks of. Not something that could be explained in words alone, and in a few hours, he would not need to ask anymore. The drive that morning felt longer, not because of distance, but because of anticipation, the kind that does not come from nerves, but from certainty, from knowing that everything is about to align exactly the way it was meant to. And as I approached the entrance, the familiar structure came into view, the gate, the guards, the controlled environment that had become more real to me than any place I had ever called home growing up. And I drove through without stopping, the recognition immediate, the acknowledgement quiet but unmistakable. Inside, the atmosphere was different from the previous days, more focused, more contained, like everything had narrowed down to this single point, and as I stepped out of the vehicle and moved across the lot, I could feel it in the way people carried themselves, in the way instructions were given and followed without delay, and I matched that energy naturally, without effort, because this was where I belonged. Not in rooms where people laughed at versions of me they did not understand, but here, where understanding was built on reality, not assumption. The briefing was shorter today, more direct, no unnecessary details, just confirmation of timing, sequence, and expectation. And I listened, absorbed, responded when needed, each interaction reinforcing the same thing, that everything was exactly where it needed to be, that there was no uncertainty left, no variables unaccounted for. At one point, as I stepped aside, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was my father calling. Not a message, not a voicemail, an actual call, and I watched the screen light up with his name, the same name that had filled a room with laughter 2 nights ago, and for a moment, I let it ring, considering the difference between then and now. The shift that had already begun even if he did not realize it yet. And when the call stopped, a voicemail followed immediately, his voice tighter this time, less composed, asking me to call him back, saying that things had gotten out of hand, that people were asking questions. And I understood then that something had already started to move on their side, something small but noticeable, enough to make him uncomfortable, enough to make him reach out in a way he never had before. I saved the message without listening to it again, because I did not need to. The tone was enough, the change was enough, and I slipped the phone back into my pocket as I stepped back into position, because whatever was happening there was no longer something I needed to manage. It would unfold on its own, just like everything else. As the hours moved forward, the final preparations clicked into place, each piece connecting seamlessly with the next. And I felt that same quiet clarity settle in again, the one that had been with me since the moment I chose to walk out of that room, the one that had guided every decision since. And I knew now that there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to reconsider. Everything was already set. When the time came to move, it was not announced loudly. There was no dramatic shift, just a subtle change in pace, in direction, in focus, and I stepped into it without hesitation, because this was not something I was stepping into for the first time. This was something I had been preparing for long before anyone had decided I was uneducated or worthless, long before they had reduced me to something small enough to laugh at. And as everything began to unfold exactly as planned, I realized something that made the entire situation almost feel distant, almost unreal in comparison. They thought they had defined me in a single moment, in a single sentence, in front of a single room. But what they did not understand was that my life had never been confined to that space, and in just a few hours, they were going to see exactly how wrong they had been. Not because I was going to tell them, but because it would be impossible for them not to see it. The room was already filled by the time I stepped into position, not crowded in the way my father's party had been, but organized, intentional, every person there with a role, a purpose, a reason to stand exactly where they were. And the atmosphere carried a weight that did not come from noise, but from expectation. The kind that builds when something important is about to happen and everyone present understands it without needing to say it out loud. I moved through the space with measured steps, aware of every detail, every shift in movement around me, and as I took my place, there was no hesitation, no second guessing, just the steady awareness that this moment had been built over years, not days, not hours, and certainly not by accident. The structure around me was precise, flags positioned perfectly, seating aligned, the kind of environment where nothing is left to chance. And as I stood there, I could feel the contrast more clearly than ever, the difference between this and that room from 2 nights ago, where everything had been casual, careless, built on assumptions and appearances. And I realized how small that world had always been compared to this one. Voices around me were low, controlled, conversations kept to what was necessary. And I caught fragments of it, confirmations, acknowledgements, final checks, all of it moving toward a single point in time that was now only minutes away, and I stayed focused, present, letting the rhythm of it settle into me the same way it always had. Because this was not a performance. This was reality. This was the version of my life that did not need to be explained or defended. My phone remained silent in my pocket now, and I knew without checking that the messages had not stopped, that the questions were still coming, that the confusion on their side was growing. But none of that reached me here. None of it had the ability to interrupt what was unfolding in front of me. And for the first time, I understood that distance not just physically, but completely, like a line had been drawn and everything on the other side of it no longer had access to me in the same way. As the event began, the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. The kind of transition that does not need to be announced because everyone feels it at the same time, and I straightened slightly, not out of tension but out of alignment. Stepping fully into the role I had spent years earning, the one no one in my family had ever asked about, the one they had unknowingly dismissed with a single sentence. There were people here who knew exactly who I was, not in the way my family thought they did, not based on outdated stories or assumptions, but based on what I had done, what I had proven, and the acknowledgement was there in the smallest gestures, in the way eyes met briefly with understanding, in the way space was made without needing to be requested, and I returned it the same way. Because this was not about recognition, it was about responsibility. At one point, as I stood waiting for the next sequence to begin, I allowed myself a single thought about them, about the moment 2 nights ago when my father had stood in front of a room and defined me so easily, so confidently, and I wondered what that room looked like now, what conversations were happening, what questions were being asked. Because I knew something had already shifted, something had already reached them even if they did not fully understand it yet, and I knew that by the time this day was over, there would be no confusion left, no room for interpretation. The next phase began with precision, each movement timed, each action aligned, and I stepped forward exactly when I was supposed to. No sooner, no later, because that is how this works, not based on emotion, not based on impulse, but based on discipline, on trust, on a structure that does not bend to perception. As I moved into place, I could feel the weight of it fully now, not heavy in a way that slows you down, but in a way that grounds you, that reminds you of everything that led here, every decision, every sacrifice, every moment that no one else had seen or understood. And I realized that this was the answer to everything they had said without me ever needing to respond directly. This was the reality that existed, whether they acknowledged it or not. Somewhere in the distance, beyond this space, beyond this structure, my phone began to vibrate again, faint, almost unnoticeable, and I knew, without looking, that it was them. Still trying to reach me, still trying to pull me back into a conversation that no longer applied, and I let it continue, let it fade, because there was nothing left for me there, nothing that needed my attention, not now, not anymore. As the sequence reached its peak, the moment everything had been building toward, I stood exactly where I was meant to be, fully present, fully aware, and for the first time since that night, I allowed myself to acknowledge the full contrast between what they believed and what was real, between the version of me they had laughed at and the one standing here now, and it was not satisfying in the way people might expect, not a moment of revenge or triumph, just a quiet, undeniable truth settling into place. And I knew, without needing to check, without needing confirmation, that somewhere, somehow, that truth was already beginning to reach them, piece by piece, detail by detail, until there would be no version of the story left where they could pretend they did not know exactly who I was. It did not happen all at once. There was no single announcement that carried my name across the room, no dramatic pause where everything stopped just for me. Instead, it unfolded the way moments like this always do, quietly at first, almost unnoticed. Like a shift in gravity that only becomes clear once everything begins to move differently. I remained exactly where I was, aligned with the sequence, focused on the responsibilities in front of me. But I could feel it, the subtle change in attention, the way certain eyes lingered a fraction longer, the way conversations adjusted in tone, not because anything had been said yet, but because something had been recognized. The structure of the event continued, precise, controlled, each step flowing into the next without disruption, and I moved with it naturally, not seeking attention, not avoiding it, just existing fully within the role I had earned. And that was when I noticed the first clear sign that the shift had reached beyond this space. One of the attendees, someone who clearly did not belong to my immediate circle but understood enough to recognize what was happening, glanced at me, then looked again, this time with a different expression, one that carried realization, and it was subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there, the moment where assumption is replaced by understanding. I did not react to it. I did not acknowledge it outwardly, because that is not how this works. Recognition is not something you chase or confirm. It is something that settles on its own when the reality in front of someone becomes impossible to ignore. As the event progressed, that realization began to spread, not loudly, not in whispers or sudden reactions, but in small, controlled shifts. The kind that ripple outward through people who know how to read a situation without needing it explained. And I understood then that whatever had started on my family's side, whatever questions had begun forming after that night, had now connected with something tangible, something they could not dismiss as easily as before. My phone remained still for a while, then suddenly vibrated again, longer this time, more persistent, and I knew without looking that something had changed, that the tone of the messages waiting for me would not be the same as before. But I did not reach for it, not yet, because this moment required my full attention, and anything happening outside of it would have to wait. The sequence moved forward, each phase completed exactly as expected, and as I stepped into the next position, I became aware of something else. Something more direct, a presence at the edge of the space. Someone observing with a level of focus that was different from the rest, and when I allowed myself a brief glance in that direction, I saw it. The recognition fully formed, no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a clear understanding of exactly who I was and what that meant in this context, and in that instant, I knew the transition was complete, not just here, but everywhere this moment would reach. I returned my focus forward immediately, because that is what you do. You do not hold on to the moment. You do not let it change your pace. You continue exactly as you were, because the power in it does not come from acknowledgement. It comes from consistency. Time moved differently then, not slower, not faster, just more defined, each second carrying more weight because of what it represented. And I could feel the culmination approaching, the point where everything aligned fully, where there would be no separation between what they believed and what was real. Somewhere in the background, beyond the controlled environment of this space, my phone began vibrating again, this time almost continuously, and I knew what that meant without needing to check. I knew that whatever had been uncertain before was now clear enough to create urgency, to create questions they could not answer on their own, and I let it continue, let it build. Because this was not something I needed to manage directly, it was something they needed to understand on their own terms. As the final phase approached, the atmosphere shifted again, not dramatically, but with a quiet intensity that everyone present recognized. The kind that signals the importance of what is about to happen, and I stepped into position once more, fully present, fully aligned, aware of everything around me but focused only on what mattered in that exact moment. And then, without any announcement, without any need for explanation, it happened, not as a reveal in the way people expect, not with words or introductions, but through the structure itself, through the way everything and everyone adjusted in relation to me, through the undeniable reality of my role within this space. And I knew in that instant that there was no version of the story left where I was invisible, no version where I could be reduced to something small enough to laugh at, because what stood here now was not open to interpretation. I held that position, steady, composed, not reacting to the shift, not acknowledging it beyond what was required, because this was not about proving anything, this was about being exactly who I was. Without explanation, without permission, and as the moment settled into place, I understood something with complete clarity. The silence that followed this would not be the same as the silence from that night. This one would carry understanding. This one would carry weight, and somewhere, far outside this room, the people who had once laughed were beginning to realize exactly what they had failed to see. The moment settled without noise, without applause, without anything that would have made it easier for someone unfamiliar to understand what had just happened. But for those who knew, for those who could read the structure of authority and responsibility without needing it explained, it was unmistakable. And I could feel that understanding solidify in the space around me like a quiet shift in air pressure, subtle but impossible to ignore. I remained steady, focused forward, allowing the sequence to complete exactly as it was designed to, not rushing, not lingering, just moving with the same precision that had carried me through every step leading up to this point. Because the strength of this moment was not in how it looked, it was in how it held, how it existed without needing validation. When it concluded, there was no dramatic break, just a natural transition as people began to move again. Conversations resuming in low, controlled tones. But something had changed, not in the structure of the event, but in the way I was positioned within it, and I could see it in the smallest details. The way someone adjusted their stance slightly when I passed, the way a conversation paused for half a second longer than necessary, the way acknowledgement was given with a level of clarity that had not been there before. I stepped out of the main area when my part was complete, moving into a quieter corridor where the noise softened into something distant, and it was only then that I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. The screen lighting up immediately with a flood of missed calls and messages, more than before, more urgent. The names familiar, but the tone completely different. I scrolled through them slowly, not reacting, just observing, my father calling multiple times in a row, messages following each missed call. Shorter now, less composed. Asking where I was. Asking what was going on. Asking why someone had just contacted him about me in a way that did not match anything he thought he knew. And I paused there for a second, not because I was surprised, but because this was the exact moment I had expected, the point where assumption collapses under the weight of reality. There were messages from Linda, no longer framed as polite concern but edged with confusion, asking what I had not told them, asking why other people seemed to know things about me that she did not, and Ashley's messages had shifted too, from dismissive to uncertain, asking if something was actually going on, and whether I had been hiding something, and I could almost hear the tone in her voice changing, the confidence fading as the narrative she had relied on started to unravel. Mark's messages stood out the most, not because they were longer, but because they were different, direct. Stripped of the casual distance he had maintained before, asking me to answer him, asking me to explain, and then finally, one message that said nothing more than, "I think I understand now." And I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because of what it implied, that the realization had reached him too, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the way he was looking at everything. I locked the phone and held it in my hand for a moment, feeling the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a signal, a clear indication that the separation I had created was now visible to them, undeniable, and for the first time since that night, I allowed myself to consider what it must look like from their side, the sudden shift, the information they could not piece together, the way everything they believed about me no longer fit with what they were starting to hear. I did not feel satisfaction in that, not in the way people might expect. There was no sense of victory or revenge. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth does not need to be forced. It simply needs to be allowed to surface. And once it does, it changes everything on its own. My phone vibrated again in my hand, my father calling once more, and this time I answered. Not because I felt obligated, not because I needed to explain anything, but because this was part of the moment too, part of the transition from what had been assumed to what was real. There was a brief pause when I picked up. Just a second of silence before his voice came through. Different from anything I had ever heard from him before, less controlled, less certain, asking where I was, asking what was going on, asking why someone had just addressed him in a way that suggested he did not know his own daughter, and I listened without interrupting, without reacting, letting him speak until the questions ran out and the silence returned. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, the same tone I had used 2 nights ago, but this time there was no room for misunderstanding, no context he could twist into something else. I told him where I was, not in detail, not with explanation, just enough for him to understand that the version of me he had described did not exist, that it never had, and I could hear it in the silence that followed, the moment where realization begins to take shape but has not fully settled yet. He started to respond, to say something that sounded like justification, like an attempt to pull the conversation back into something familiar, but I did not let it continue, not out of disrespect, But because that part of the story was already over, and I ended the call with the same calm finality I had carried through everything else. I stood there for a moment after the line went quiet, not thinking about what he would say next, not anticipating any reaction, just acknowledging that the shift was complete, that there was no longer any space left for them to define me based on what they had chosen not to see. And as I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned to rejoin the rest of the day, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by their understanding, but by the reality that was already in place, the one they were only just beginning to recognize. When I stepped back into the main area, nothing had changed on the surface. The structure was still intact, the sequence still moving forward with the same controlled precision. But underneath it, something was undeniably different, not in the environment itself, but in how I carried myself within it, because now the separation was complete, not just in my mind, but in theirs. And I could feel that shift settling into place like something permanent. I resumed my position without hesitation, picking up exactly where I had left off, because that is how this works. You do not pause for personal moments. You do not allow outside noise to interfere. You continue, steady and focused, and that consistency is what holds everything together. Around me, the event continued to unfold with the same level of discipline, each movement aligned with purpose, each interaction measured and intentional, and I matched it naturally, not thinking about what had just happened on the phone, not replaying my father's voice or the silence that followed my words, because that part of the story was already behind me, already settled in a way that did not require revisiting. As I moved through the next phase, I became aware again of the subtle changes in how others responded, not exaggerated, not dramatic, but precise, the kind of acknowledgement that comes when understanding has fully replaced assumption, and I recognized it without reacting to it. Because the goal had never been recognition, it had been truth, and truth does not need to be announced to exist. Time moved forward steadily, each moment building on the last, and I stayed present within it, focused on the responsibilities in front of me, because that is where my attention belonged, not on what my family was processing miles away, not on the questions they were asking or the conclusions they were beginning to reach, but here, where everything was real and measurable and grounded in action. At one point, as I transitioned between positions, someone approached me briefly, not with curiosity or surprise, but with clarity. A short exchange, direct and professional. The kind that carries weight without needing explanation, and I responded in the same way, because this was not a moment for reflection, it was a moment for execution, and everything else would follow on its own. My phone remained silent now, and I knew that silence meant something different than before, not absence, but pause, the kind that comes after realization begins to take hold, when people stop asking questions because they are trying to understand the answers they have already received. And I did not check it. I did not need to, because whatever was happening there was already in motion and no longer required my involvement. As the day moved closer to its conclusion, the atmosphere shifted again, not in intensity, but in completion. The sense that everything had unfolded as intended, that each part had connected seamlessly with the next, and I could feel that same clarity settle in once more, the one that had guided me from the moment I chose not to react 2 nights ago, the one that had carried me through every step since. When the final sequence ended, there was no dramatic closure, just a natural transition as the structure relaxed, as people began to move with slightly less rigidity, conversations opening up just enough to signal that the critical part of the day was complete, and I stepped out of that structure with the same composure I had maintained throughout, not shifting, not releasing anything outwardly, just allowing the moment to pass as it was meant to. I moved into a quieter space again, away from the main area, and only then did I take out my phone, the screen lighting up immediately with new messages. Fewer now, but more focused, more direct. My father's name appearing again, but this time there was no flood of calls, just a single message, short, uncharacteristically restrained, asking if we could talk later, and I read it once before setting the phone down, because I understood what it represented, not an attempt to control the narrative, not an attempt to dismiss what had happened, but the beginning of something else, something unfamiliar to him, something that did not come easily. There were messages from Linda as well, different in tone, less certain, more cautious, asking what was going on without the edge she had carried before, and Ashley had stopped messaging entirely, which in itself said more than anything she could have written. And Mark's last message remained unchanged. I think I understand now, sitting there like a quiet acknowledgement of a reality he had not seen until it was too clear to ignore. I stood there for a moment, looking at the screen, not feeling the need to respond immediately, not feeling pulled back into any of it, because whatever conversations would happen next would not change what had already been established. They would not redefine me. They would not undo the distance that now existed, and I realized that for the first time, I was not waiting for anything from them, not an apology, not recognition, not even understanding, because none of it was necessary anymore. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked around the quiet space, the controlled environment that had always reflected the truth of who I was, and I allowed myself a single, steady breath, not of relief, not of release, but of confirmation that everything had aligned exactly as it needed to, that nothing from that night had taken anything from me, and that what they had lost in that moment was not something I needed to take back. As I turned to leave, stepping out of the building and into the open air, the light different now, softer as the day began to settle, I understood with complete clarity that this was not an ending, not in the way they would think of it. It was simply a transition, one that had already begun the moment I chose silence over reaction. And as I walked forward without looking back, I knew that whatever came next would not be defined by where I came from, but by where I had already proven I belonged. That evening felt quieter than any night I could remember, not because the world had slowed down, but because something inside me had finally stopped waiting, and as I drove back from the base, the road stretching out in front of me under soft amber streetlights, I realized there was no tension left, no anticipation, no unfinished thought lingering in the background, just a steady sense of completion that did not need to be announced to be real. When I reached my apartment and stepped inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, the same clean lines, the same intentional simplicity, but it felt different now, not like a place I returned to, but like a place I fully owned, without any part of me still tied to expectations that no longer applied. I set my keys down, slipped off my shoes, and for a moment I just stood there, taking in the silence, not empty, not heavy, just calm, the kind of calm that comes when there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. And I understood then that whatever conversation was going to happen next with my family would not be about me trying to explain myself. It would be about them trying to understand something they had never taken the time to see. My phone rested on the counter, still, no longer buzzing constantly, and when I picked it up, there were only a few new messages, my father's still the same, asking if we could talk. Linda's cautious follow-up, and then one from Ryan, the first message he had sent that was not filtered through quiet judgment or distance, just a simple line. I did not know, and I read it twice. Not because it was surprising, but because of how much was contained in those 3 words. The acknowledgement of a gap, of an assumption, of something he had never questioned until now. I set the phone down again without replying, not out of avoidance, but because I knew that whatever I said now would not carry the same weight as what they had already seen, and this was not a moment for explanations. It was a moment for them to sit with the realization on their own. I moved through the apartment slowly, not with the routine of preparation like the past few days, but with a quiet awareness of where I was and what had shifted, opening a window to let in the cool evening air, the faint sound of the city in the distance, steady and constant. A reminder that life continues whether or not people understand each other in the moment. I poured a glass of water and leaned lightly against the counter, letting my thoughts move without forcing them. And for the first time since that night, I allowed myself to revisit it. Not the words themselves, not the laughter, but the feeling of standing there, of being defined so easily in front of a room full of people who accepted it without question. And I realized something that had not been clear before. It was never really about what they said. It was about how comfortable they were saying it, how certain they were that it was true, and how little they had ever tried to see beyond that. My phone vibrated once, a new message. And when I looked down, it was from my father again. Not a call this time, just a text, shorter than before. I was wrong. And I held the phone for a second longer than I had with any of the other messages, not because it changed anything, but because it was the first time I had ever seen those words from him. The first time he had stepped out of the certainty he had always carried and into something unfamiliar, something uncertain. I did not respond right away. I let the message sit there, not as a decision, but as a pause, because I knew that whatever came next needed to come from a place that was steady, not reactive, and for the first time, I felt no pressure to answer quickly. No urgency to fix anything, just the freedom to choose if and when I would engage. I walked into the bedroom and glanced at the uniform still neatly in place, the insignia resting exactly where I had left it, and I thought about how long that part of my life had existed without their knowledge, not because I was hiding, but because they had never asked, never looked closely enough to see it, and I realized that the distance between us had not been created in a single moment. It had been there for years, built quietly through assumptions and unspoken decisions about who I was. When I returned to the living room, my phone was still in my hand, the screen dimming as I considered it, and I finally typed a response, not long, not detailed, just enough to acknowledge the message without opening the door to something I was not ready to step into yet, and I set the phone down again, feeling no need to check it, no need to anticipate what would come next. I moved toward the window and looked out at the city lights, scattered and steady, each one representing a life, a story, a version of reality that existed independently of anyone else's perception. And I understood then that what had changed was not just how they saw me, it was how I saw the space between us. No longer something I needed to close, no longer something I needed to fix, but something I could leave as it was without losing anything of myself. And as the night settled in, quiet and unforced, I realized that the most important part of all of this was not the moment they finally understood who I was. It was the moment I stopped needing them to understand it in order for it to matter. Weeks passed, and life did not suddenly become perfect. It did not transform into something dramatic or unrecognizable, but it became something quieter, something steadier, something that finally felt like it belonged to me. My days followed a rhythm that no longer felt like I was splitting myself between two worlds. There was no version of me I had to hide, no part of my life I had to downplay or explain, and in that simplicity, I found a kind of peace I had not realized I had been missing for years. My phone still lit up from time to time, messages from my father that were different now, shorter, more careful, like he was learning how to speak to me without assumptions, and I responded when I was ready. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. Because for the first time, I understood that connection does not have to come at the cost of self-respect. I saw them again eventually. Not at a party, not in a room filled with laughter and expectations, but in a quiet setting where no one was performing for anyone else, and the difference was clear, not just in how they looked at me, but in how they listened, how they paused before speaking, how they no longer filled the silence with things they assumed to be true. It was not perfect, it was not a complete repair of everything that had been broken, but it was honest, and that was enough. What I learned from all of this is something I wish I had understood much earlier, that you do not have to argue with people to prove your worth. You do not have to defend yourself against every misunderstanding. And you do not have to stay in spaces where you are constantly being reduced to something smaller than you are. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step back, stay silent, and let the truth reveal itself in its own time. If you are listening to this and you have ever been in a room where people laughed at you, dismissed you, or decided who you were without ever asking, I want you to know this. Their version of you is not your responsibility to carry, and you do not need their permission to become who you already are. It is okay to walk away. It is okay to choose yourself. And it is more than okay to build a life that does not rely on their understanding to feel real. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for holding space for something that is not always easy to talk about. Because sometimes the hardest parts of our lives are the ones that shape us the most, and sharing them makes it a little less heavy, a little less lonely. And if this story touched something in you, I would really like to hear from you. What is one moment in your life where you chose yourself even when it was difficult? And if this truly resonated with your heart, you can like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to you. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is this: never let someone else's limited view define the full truth of who you are.